I want to believe that museums in South Africa have not really developed a strong focus on restitution as yet. And so this is actually a great opportunity for us. And I think I should begin actually by reminding us that the museum that we find ourselves in was established in 1825, and as the first museum in Southern Africa, was also part of the colonial and later the apartheid era. And this, of course, has significant implications in terms of the collecting practices, cataloging, documentation, archives, and interpretations associated with, in particular, our ethnographic collections. According to Patricia Davison, Margaret Shaw was the first full-time ethnologist at the South African Museum and was advised by the government ethnologist N.J. van Warmelo on developing a system of classification for ethnographic objects. The ethnographic collections comprise mainly materials from Africa, with special emphasis on Southern Africa. However, particularly in those earlier days, collections were also brought from other parts of the world, apparently for comparative purposes, and these included Australian Aborigine materials, Inuit, and other materials. But of course, in addition to the South African collections, the indigenous collections, we also have collections from Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and then of course also from other parts of Africa. The South African Museum was mainly a natural history museum, and the inclusion of indigenous peoples' culture and history in the ethnographic displays is a difficult legacy that the Iziko Museums has had to deal with, and actually is still presently working through. The South African Cultural History Museum, which was based where the Slave Lodge, the Iziko Slave Lodge Museum now is, was established in 1966, but excluded the history and culture of the majority of South Africans. So you had a museum, the South African Cultural History Museum, focused on white history and culture, as it were, and you had the South African Museum focused on natural history, but also then focused on the indigenous communities, the Khoi, the San, and the Bantu-speaking peoples of Southern Africa. Racial science played a strong role in the collecting, cataloging, researching of ethnographic collections in the colonial period. And I'm not going to go through the details of the Drury casts. I'm sure you're all familiar with those stories. The ethnographic gallery at the South African Museum was finally deinstalled in September 2017 and included a cleansing ceremony by the Khoi Busman Nguni Coalition. Most of the focus with regard to restitution on our part has been on human remains, and of course this urgency to just deal with and return human remains. But we haven't really started to look at restitution with regard to military looting, archaeological expeditions, objects of sovereignty, sacred collections, and other collections that were taken from South Africa and ended up in Europe and the United States. But it's important that we do begin to develop a focus, that we do begin to set up a database and understand what is out there, but also how those materials were actually taken out of South Africa. And it's important that we work, of course, with other colleagues across Southern Africa and across Africa. As Patrick Gaspard of the Open Foundation has said, we recognize the power of art and culture to call into question structural inequalities, challenge prejudices, and foster the imagination of a new generation of leaders. So restitution is not only about the return of looted objects, but also about challenging and transforming the racist narratives and interpretations from that colonial and apartheid past about African cultures. Now, Prof. Rassool has argued that South Africa must be seen as a society marked by multiple colonialism and colonialities. And of course, our history, we've had Dutch rule, we've had British rule, and South Africa has operated as a colonial power in regard to Namibia and other countries, but then also internally with a focus on segregation and apartheid. And so when we talk about restitution, we've got to consider all of that. So restitution in terms of bringing back what was taken from South Africa, but also restitution in terms of giving back what was taken from Namibia and other countries. And then sometimes we shrink away from it, but we also do need to look at sacred materials that really shouldn't be locked up in museum storerooms, that should be either with communities or that should have a relationship, should enable us to have a dynamic relationship between communities and the museum. And I think this opens up a whole lot of opportunities for us. And it's important that we do the provenance research. And I just want to give, just in closing, we had Laura Gibson, who did some research on the Nguni collections that had been part of the South African Museum's ethnographic collections. And she tells the story of coming across what was described in the catalogue cards as a Nguni sweat scraper. And that's all she could find. But in digging around, she actually came across a catalogue in the hand of Dunn, Dunn had served in the British Army during the Anglo-Zulu Wars. And in his description, Dunn said, a friend in the, and I can't repeat the word he used, in the something war of 1876, shot the, and again I can't repeat who wore this. And there are around 286 items of ethnographic material forming part of the Dunn collection. And of course, it's really important that we actually look through that and consider the ethical questions that arise out of collections like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks everyone for being here. I want to get started so that we maximize our time with the discussants. So, maybe I should introduce myself. Sorry, I'm Dr. Wendy Black. I'm the Curator of Archaeology and newly appointed Chief Curator of Social History and Art Collections. So very well placed to be here this evening and honored to be having this kind of discussion. But for our discussants, I'd first like to ask, just in terms of a broad definition, what do we mean by cultural restitution? This might be different across continents, within Africa, just within the UK. How do we understand cultural restitution in terms of the work people are doing, in terms of social justice, and in terms of healing? Perhaps we could start with the South African perspective.
Thank you very much, Wendy. It's a very important question because we have tended to use the concept of restitution and the concept of repatriation almost interchangeably as synonyms. But there are key differences between these concepts that are important in this field. And both of these terms are used for the national policy that has recently been adopted by the Cabinet of South Africa and by Parliament. It is a national policy on what is called the restitution and repatriation of human remains, heritage objects, and documentation. A very interesting policy that we will come to shortly. Iziko Museums and its component collections and departments have been doing repatriation for many years. They have our colleagues in art collections and what was once the Iziko South African, or what was once the South African National Gallery, what was once the South African Museum, have occasionally busied themselves on the international market and have gone to auctions, have followed international auctions, and have put in bids for important South African cultural materials that I'm very pleased to say from time to time they have been lucky enough to be able to secure for Iziko Museum's collections. In other words, they have purchased South African cultural materials that have been overseas on and placed on the market. Now, that can be seen as a repatriation, a return to the original location of that object, bringing the object back to the fatherland. It's a masculinist term. It is a term that tends to have national connotations because it's about patria. It's about fatherland. And some of our colleagues have recently begun to talk about rematriation. But restitution is another kettle of fish. Restitution is a restoration. Restitution is a return. And restitution sets up a process of making claims and submitting claims, of building claims, and of seeing claims through until returns happen. So restitution obviously has political dimensions. Sometimes that can be state to state. They have legal dimensions. They involve the legal apparatus of certain societies. France, for example, has a national policy on inalienability. It is legally not possible to return an artifact that is in the national patrimony of France, except if a law is passed. But most importantly, there are important social aspects to restitution. Restitution might happen on a state-to-state basis, but it will only succeed if it happens through community work, if it happens through a consultative process, if it happens through a much wider process of consultation. And as we have seen sometimes we've seen in the practice of restitutions, and I'm sure some of you have kept your eyes on restitution processes. Some of you might have been keeping your eyes on the restitution of human remains from Berlin, from Stuttgart to our colleagues in Namibia, and you know about the magnificent occasions in State Garden of the return of skulls of people from the genocide that had been taken to Germany. And unfortunately, what we are learning is that restitution is not a singular event. It is not a single event of a return that happens on a state occasion. And unfortunately, what is bound to happen is the logics of the way governments deal with issues will come to pass. Governments are used to events management. That is the domain of how governments do things. And unfortunately, what we are learning is the work of restitution begins when the return happens. And we have just been listening to an amazing account of the return of the 26 objects to the Republic of Benin, to what was historically Dahomey, and which, as you know, was the subject of the decision by Emmanuel Macron and the French to do a return in light of the report conducted by our colleagues Felwine Sa and Benedict Savoy. And you are watching those processes, and we have learnt about how the Nigerians came by yacht around the ocean to come and participate in the events in the Republic of Benin. We have seen scenes of jubilation on the streets of Cotonou. We have seen celebration because there is a campaign. Now, restitution is something that is going to be with us, and as people who know my work know that I want to argue, and I have been arguing, that the work of restitution potentially represents this new museology that we want to incorporate, that we want to inaugurate. But I know you have some questions for Dan.
I do.
But maybe I can...
Yeah, I'd like to hear your opinion
I can answer
on
the same question, and
restitution.
I can build on, all those important words that we've just heard, and say, and hold on to that image that we just were presented with of joy, the joy that we have been watching and hearing about from Benin, because restitution, we've heard a lot of things about what restitution is. What restitution is not loss. So think about the removal of a racist display in a museum. There are examples quite near to home. There are examples from around the world that we could think of. The removal, as we are having to do in the Pitt Rivers, some of the words that were not said earlier on, the racial slurs, are written on cards which are in the displays, in the museum in which I work, until a recent project started to remove them and to notice them and to take them out. So the removal of a racial slur from a display in public, the removal of a narrative that is there not simply to misrepresent, but to hurt, that is there in order to put forward an image from 100 years ago of a certain vision of cultural supremacy, white cultural supremacy. That is not a loss. Such acts are all about what can happen next. They are necessary. Returns of objects that were taken not simply for cultural dispossession, not simply for the attempt to claim sovereignty, not simply to seek to destroy traditional religion, but even more than all those things, but even more to seek to undertake an enduring cultural dispossession in which the supposedly universal vision of the museum from the global north sought to bring into its space those objects. That, for understanding what that violence is, we, of course, need sort of only to reach back to Fanon. And Frantz Fanon's absolutely central essay on racism and culture, where he makes the crucial distinction, writing, I think, in 1956, he points out that in the 19th century, vulgar racism, as he puts it, racism concerned with natural history, with the perversions of science that came to be the racial science, the fake racial science. That vulgar racism, which concerned itself with the body, with the skin, with the appropriation of the human form as hair, as all sorts of bodily forms, and castes, of course, even castes, as we know in this museum. That very soon was accompanied by a second kind of racism, which we are only just, incredibly, only just in our museums beginning to see. And we're beginning to see that other kind of racism because the colonial museum has failed. And when something fails, you know, when you're on your way to work and your car won't start, and you have to open up the bonnet and work out, how do I fix this thing? Am I able to fix it? Does the car need to be scrapped? Or, you know, what do we need to do? Does something need to be taken out and something else replaced? What needs to happen to the car? The point is, on that morning when you're on your way to work as any normal morning and then the car won't start, you see the car. The car is there in a way that it is not on any normal morning. That's what's happening to these institutions in which I work, in which our colleagues here work. The museum has failed, and we are seeing, therefore, Fanon's second form of racism, which was cultural racism. In the crisis for supremacy that came in the wake of abolition and emancipation, the mid-19th century liberal humanism that told the story that we're all human needed still to find some argument for difference and for superiority, and culture and art and technology filled that gap. So I work in an institution, arguably one of the founding institutions at Oxford, for something that started happening around the world, the telling of a story that human difference is not, you know, a matter for natural history, but a matter for cultural history. And we built these institutions to tell, you know, that story. So our museums, our art galleries, our museums were put to work in order to make that world vision seem natural, seem impossible. How can art be hurtful? How can culture be hurtful? How can a museum be weaponized? How could anyone that criticizes a museum be anything other than attacking? This is iconoclasm. We need to defend the museum. I mean, you know, these people knew what they were doing, right? In the surprisingly short sort of temporal window between, say, the 1870s and the 1920s, in which anthropology, archaeology, the museums, and notions of heritage were laid down on this basis. Statues were built in the streets, you know, in order to normalize and naturalize, again, if we go to Fanon, you know, the message of every one of those images of the general, of Rhodes, was, you know, the message, as he puts it, was absolutely simple. We are here by the force of our bayonets. The normalization, the naturalization of that violence in the image of the white male, of the patriarchy, as we've heard a moment ago, linked to that notion of heritage, is inherent in our institutions. So removing that layer, that hurtful cancer at the heart of these institutions, that thing that has failed, and if we're not careful, if we ignore it any longer, it's not going to go away. It's going to continue to, it will continue to grow, it will continue to hurt, because, and this is my final point before I let you come back with your next question, because the point is that the museum is a durational technology. It's a museum, and so the museum is a tool, it's an idea, it's an institution that works with the myth, with the trick, that it can stop time. It can intervene with time. We slow things down through the work and the gestures of the conservator. We pretend that history can stand still. We pretend certain cultures can be timeless. We pretend in that way. But of course, what that means is something awful, which is that the violence is reinscribed, reenacted every day. We open the doors and we display an image, an object or an image which is there in order to cause hurt. But it's a positive and hopeful observation too, because we don't know how this ends. We don't know how the project of the World Culture Museum, of the Anthropology Archaeology Museum, there is hope. Some of it might need to be burnt to the ground, right? But not necessarily the whole gesture. There is hope. And as someone that works in a museum, has worked in the Pitt Rivers for 15 years, I guess that is part of my own intervention in these conversations.
So how have we got here? I don't mean the institution or the museum. We all know how that arrived and was developed. It's more about how did we get to this situation of discussing cultural restitution, of talking about changing the way we catalogue an object or removing exhibitions. I mean, is it because of books like yours, Dan, or academic work by Ciraj and a number of other noted academics over 20, 30, 40 years? Or is it movements like Black Lives Matter and Roads Must Fall, if we're keeping it more local? What drives this global movement in talking about restitution?
Well, there certainly have been a sequence of developments in South Africa that have driven our discussion and our debate about restitution. And I think the first point is that this institution where we gather, a component, a space, a site of Iziko Museums of South Africa, created to be a national flagship museum, in which undertook the complicated, almost impossible task of rendering older histories of collecting as collections of the new nation. Enormously difficult task to retheme, to rethink, to take that fundamental division that was installed in this museum history between the ethnographic, or what the Germans call the ethnologisch, and cultural history. A fundamental distinction in the museum, in the modern museum. It marks the modern museum. You go to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and if you do not go to the National Museum of African Art, or if you do not go to the African history sections in the early part of the display of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you will find the display of African societies in the Natural History Museum, because the ethnographic is a subset of natural history. That is the fundamental division that occurred. And in the ways in which colonization happened in Southern Africa, in which different groups of people who were conquered and subjected to domination, this occurred through different disciplines. In the case of Bantu-speaking people, it happened through cultural anthropology, through social anthropology, in which people were governed and administered as people of tribe and ethnicity, and in which Khoisan people were rendered as members of disappearing races and were subject to racial research. That's the history of the diorama, and that was the history of the collection of human remains. So it is in the nature of museums, modern museum, that it presents itself as the fundamental institution of care. It cares for objects for future generations. And if you suggest to that museum that something does not belong in its collection, should be taken out of its collection, should be returned somewhere, it is like presenting an argument that is almost anathema to the essence of what museums apparently are. But there have been very important discussions in conventional museum spaces about removing objects from collections, maybe because they've run out of space, or maybe because the object has no meaning any longer in the collection. But what has happened is a certain stage in the decolonisation process in which independence came to African societies, but European museums held on to those collections. I think that the strides happened in relation to human remains. And those developments have happened very quickly, as I've seen these developments, where today in Germany, everybody accepts that it is completely and utterly inappropriate for their museums to hold human remains of African and other formerly colonized people. There is absolute agreement on that. In the case of South Africa, you know that history. You know the return of the remains of Sarah Baartman. You know about the return of the remains of Klaas and Troy Pinaar in 2012. You know the debates that we have held in this very space and in other spaces in the country about the importance of returning human remains to the places from which they come and undertaking reburials. This museum has been through a process of deaccessioning unethically obtained human remains and keeping them in non-access sites until such time as a national policy is arrived at. And that time has come. Except what we have done now is that national policy also says that we need to look at the relationship in the collecting history of human remains and material culture. Because we have been able to draw direct connections, both in Austria and in Germany, of how human remains and cultural artifacts were collected together, and how those scholars on those expeditions at the same time took photographs, made field sound recordings, made film, and somehow in Germany those collections have gotten divided into different museums, separated from each other, so that there has been a loss of cultural memory of how they were assembled together, because what has happened, alongside the acceptance of the violence represented by the presence of human remains in the museum, is we have the perpetuation of the myth of the ethnological museum being the space of care. And what has happened now? Pressure from activists in our colleagues in Berlin Postkolonial and others, activists in other cities have put an agenda, have put forward a certain agenda so that the debate has escalated. It is not I don't want to say it is I'm not proclaiming any victories because we've had the emergence of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, which does not represent a victory at all. And so there is this, and there is, I think, an important history to be told of what has happened in France, what has happened in Belgium, what has happened in Berlin, in Germany, and the failures and at times the moments of realization that has happened in the UK. And let me hand over to Dan to address some of those developments.
Sure, okay. Thanks so much, Ciraj. So the question was, why now? And, it isn't anything to do with my book. My book is simply a curator. My book is simply evidence written from an institution more than 130 years old that a stopwatch will tell the right time every 130 years or so, right? That the Pitt Rivers is a space to think from at this moment that can tell us about hundreds, if not thousands, of other museums like it around the world. And, at the heart of that really is that sense of recognizing, think back to roads falling in 2015 here in Cape Town. Think back to the generational nature of that necessary fall. After apartheid ended, we're told, there 21 years later, students born after the end of apartheid still experiencing racism in all its forms, institutional racism, direct racial, casual racism, at the heart of the academy, and at the heart of that academy, at the heart of that university, an image, an artwork proclaiming the image of, the celebration of a mass murderer, of one of the key figures in corporate militarist colonialism. And the corporate nature, one of the nuances, and these debates are nuanced in every different location in the world, especially across the continent of Africa, the corporate nature of these forms of empire that we're talking about, these later forms of 19th century empire that are so missing from the national consciousness in the UK. We have a big Queen Victoria-sized black hole in our historical consciousness in the UK. We tell a story of abolition, 1807, emancipation, 1838. Then there's this big, maybe the Crimean War, but in terms of the international role of the British, we jump suddenly to winning the First World War, winning the Second World War, the World Cup of 1966. That's the story that we tell ourselves as a nation state. And actually, increasingly, with the populism that we've seen around sort of Brexit and so on. And yet, in every year of Queen Victoria's reign, there was war. War at an increasing pace. War against the continent of Africa. War often wrapped up in the pretense that it was the putting down of the slave trade, whereas those naval operations, such as, of course, the one I've written about in Nigeria, in what's now Nigeria in 1897, the sheer violence of those attacks obviously continued. So a similar generational shift, a similar sense of what Achille Mbembe, when he wrote about the Rhodes fall, referred to as a negative moment. He spoke about a negative moment being a time in which old antagonisms remain while new ones emerge. And for restitution, we curators, my generation of curators have failed in our attempt simply to take items that are supposedly difficult, contentious, contested, off display, and hide them away in the stories. You know, just look at the debates happening at Harvard, at the Peabody, at Penn, in America, where the recognition that enslaved African Americans are among, you know, the 20,000 individuals represented in the human remains collections of the Peabody, the national conversation that's coming out of such observations show us, and of course that's just the tip of the iceberg, and it's only human remains we're talking about. They're not the vast range of you know, looted objects, of archaeological objects and so on, that found their way from one continent to another for the purposes of outdated paradigms of anthropology and archaeology. So the intergenerational moment for restitution we find ourselves in is that we can no longer pretend simply by shutting the door, but also by not sharing or even finding out what we have. It shocks many people to learn that we don't know what is in most of the European museums. There are not accurate databases for every object supposedly in our care. We do not know what African objects we have with any certainty. Many are in boxes that haven't been opened for 100 years. There are many of the most significant collections which obviously are not in the British Museum. They're in the regional UK collections, from Ipswich to Belfast to Edinburgh to Liverpool to Manchester to Oxford and Cambridge to Bristol to Exeter. All of these collections, 40 or more of the museums, you know, many are orphaned collections. They don't even have a world culture curator. These things are locked away, and in so many cases, they're not simply objects, they're subjects. They are not simply representing ancestors, but are constituting ancestors for those groups, those nations, those communities who may wish to demand their return if they only knew that they existed. So, why is South Africa not part of this conversation? You know, I think that is one of the questions I find hard to understand. This is, for us, from the supply side of restitution, if I could possibly put it that way, this is a case-by-case approach responding to demands. So the real question, I'd say, is not why is everyone talking about restitution? It's why are people not talking about restitution in any meaningful way, whether in terms of the nation state here in South Africa, or whether in terms of opening up the crucial dialogue and leadership that will come from indigenous groups, because this, of course, is who is claiming what is at the heart of this. We know that this takes time. We know it doesn't happen overnight, but we know that there are many bad faith actors from the richest and most powerful institutions who wish to talk and talk and talk until they're all so bored of this issue. It all seems so complex, so entangled, so difficult, so contested that, there are two sides to this. We need the balance sheet. We need to talk about the good side. And then suddenly someone starts talking about the railways, right? And we're into the positive sides of empire if we're not careful. So no, the question has to be, this issue lands in different ways in different locations. Every institution is different. Every society is different. Each object is different. But why does the Pitt Rivers not have any active demands for returns from objects from the nation of South Africa? I'd love to know the answer.
Yes, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
I realise we're meant to be answering the questions.
No, we'll get to that. But sticking with the activism and generational shift, I am acutely aware that I'm not young anymore. And no offense to my colleagues, we're not in our 20s. We're not the activist academics I'd like to say I used to be. So have you seen any approaches by young people, particularly in South Africa, black students rising up, wanting to learn more about archaeology, anthropology, paleosciences, change the way these disciplines are viewed, really approaching a decolonized way of thinking. And there are groups and academics trying to change the face of these kinds of disciplines, from museological work to archaeology and anthropology. But are you seeing this in the work that you're doing, that you're starting to see youth really getting involved, and they are the next generation to answer these questions, which, you know, the older people seem to be stuck with?
Sure. So let me go first, and I'll hand over to Ciraj just to mix it up a bit. So yeah, I mean, we're not activists, right? I mean, we're just doing our job, you know. You know, Ciraj is a professor of history. This is his job. In the culture wars in the UK, we're told, don't rewrite history, which I guess means you're out of a job, or at least you better not come to the UK and try and do it all. Or we have to push back against that so-called, that fake culture war, which of course is simply, it's, you know, what I described earlier. It's the war on culture. It's the weaponization of culture for a particular outdated worldview, which is very much, because of the movement for Black Lives, is very much about, in its death throes, one would hope, in some ways, and it is pushing back hard. So you know, so we're not activists. And I'm a curator. I mean, my job as a museum curator, restitution has been a normal part of my field. We can't say this too often. It's been said already, but let's underline it. In the very different historical circumstances of Holocaust returns, in the case of human remains. I mean, I'm old enough to remember in the 90s when these issues themselves were contentious. We were told in the case of Holocaust returns, if you give this artwork back, how can you make sure you're giving it to the right person? Why do you want to drag up all these difficult histories? If you give it back, what are they going to do with it? It might not be seen by the public. They might sell it. Well, yeah, too right. It's their item. It's their object. The same is now true increasingly of cultural remains, you know, of cultural objects, when they are demanded. And the Washington Principles of 1998 set out, you know, really crucial sort of part of this ethics of curation, which is it moved the onus of responsibility for knowing what was looted, what was taken, from the claimant to the institution. Let's imagine world culture museums where nothing is stolen. Let's imagine museums like this one, where if an object is demanded, there is an open and transparent sort of process to return, but also where an institution like this can play a role in seeing returns to South Africa. What's so interesting about this institution and this situation is that restitution works in both directions, because we're in a settler state, but we're also one against which violence, you know, has happened in relation to culture. So yeah, I think that if that goes some way to answering it, you know, the new generation, the world is changing around us. I said earlier that the trick of the museum is to seem like it's timeless. Some curators like me and you have mistaken our role as something larger than just making sure that the moths aren't eating the fabrics and the iron work isn't rusting away. We have come to believe, we've had a sort of mission creep through which we've started to believe that our job is to stop the world from changing around us. And that, of course, that's what's happened. We can't do that anymore because the world has moved on too far. It's a greatly hopeful moment, though, I think, for our museums. I've never felt more optimistic for museums, actually, than I do right now, because these things are possible. We can start to... Why should we have to live with this infrastructure of Fanon's cultural racism? Why? Surely it's now possible to start physically to dismantle it, because once you have done, You open up a space and time for what happens next.
There was a time and I'd like to think that this is a part of the kind of activism that Wendy is calling for. I'd like to think that in the mid to late 1990s, when the Department of History at the University of the Western Cape, and when Patricia Hayes and Leslie Witts and I and some other colleagues sent our students into Iziko South African Museum deliberately to come and cause trouble, to come and interrogate Patricia Davison, to come and interrogate the staff in the corridors about the diorama, about the African Cultures Gallery, as part of a course that we began to teach that we called Africa, Race and Empire. And where we were concerned about the museum history of racism, we were concerned about caste making. We began to be concerned about human remains collecting as we learnt about that history. We were interested in how castes were incorporated into an invented scene of culture by Margaret Shaw, and by the position that was articulated by some of the leaders of this museum at that time. They agreed these were problematic displays, but people needed to be shown as part of culture and nature. And there was a kind of compromise. But the pressure began, and at the time, our museum concerns were about the problem of race, problematizing, about it was an anti-racist activism that the students enacted through their academic work. And it's more than a decade of work of students researching this, writing essays, and thinking about dioramas, thinking about castes. And onto that legacy, I would like to think we have placed restitution and rehumanization. We have placed the human remains of the colonial human remains from the museum alongside the human remains of anti-apartheid fighters murdered by the apartheid state in the work of recovery done by missing persons task team, and to think about those, about dead ancestors from those different histories of racism together. So there's been a desire for an anti-racist activism. And I think, I'd like to think that we have a new generation coming through. We have exciting graduate students, Romario Cluti, Dean Stefanus. We have Sophie Shah-Sepen, who's just finished a PhD a few months ago. We have new young staff members in our department, Robin Humphreys, and we have other colleagues. And it is, okay, I don't want to draw an analogy here. This is not, academic work doesn't happen like political mobilization. It's not a political mobilization, but it's a mobilization of an anti-racist education project, which is what our work at the University of the Western Cape has been, in an institution created for certain purpose, mobilizing an anti-racist education project into the work of the ongoing democratization of the museum, of the remaking and the rethinking of the museum. And this is work that we are doing with our colleagues here at Iziko Museums, with our colleagues in the Museums Association of Namibia, that we do in memory of our late colleague and comrade, Dr. Jeremy Sylvester, who passed away from COVID last year. This is work that we do with our colleagues from Cameroon, from Senegal, that we do in these alliances that we are forming. But we also work with our colleagues who are curators of collections in different European museums. And because we've been through certain experiences, we have been in a position to advise other countries, to advise Germany on these developments, to advise Belgium, because we have been through important experiences in South Africa of going through restitution of human remains and framing it in a certain way, framing it, raising the question that a dehumanization had occurred, that what the museum has done through genericization and objectification has been a dehumanization built on top of the dehumanization that people experienced in life. And so this is activist work, but it is work that also happens in a way that is safeguarded, I'd like to think, within our university, and that is safeguarded in the way that we take up this relationship with museums, because this is also public work.
Thanks, Ciraj. So sticking to this feeling of hope and optimism, there have been a number of positive results, and some of them we've mentioned here. Return of individuals to Namibia, some return of objects to Benin. And to answer part of your question that you asked me, that yes, Iziko has been spearheading this kind of process for a number of years, where we've got vast community networks. We've been doing a lot of outreach in terms of sharing what we have in our collections, and we're ready to take the next step. And just in terms of Iziko's relationship with Pitt Rivers, I've already been in touch with a researcher pre-COVID who was here, had a look at our collections. We've been talking about how we can initiate a process, and now that COVID restrictions are lifted, we can start that up again. But as the last question to our panel members before we open to you, I would like to know what this process looks like for you and what kind of projects you're working on. What would you like to see happening with South Africa specifically, and perhaps Pan-Africa a little more general?
Sure. Okay, thanks. Well, maybe I can go first. So yeah, I mean, as a curator responsible for something impossibly called world archaeology, I mean, you know, we don't balance that notion against the fact we're talking about the global majority perspectives upon museums. I mean, you know, we need to think about that term. But look, we've got more than 10,000 objects from South Africa in the collections of the Pitt Rivers. You know, I can't tell you about each individual item because that work just hasn't been done. We have items that were taken as trophies of war from the battlefield. You know, we have items of sovereignty. We have items of belief, sacred items. We have archaeological items. We have whole hunks of rock art lifted from the landscape and transported by ship to Oxford. You know, we even have, I think I'm right in saying, a whole box section of soil, which is basically an archaeological site that was picked up and transported. You know, you can't make this stuff up. You know, we and it is not, what's it doing in Oxford? Why is it there? The vast majority is not on display, and that's from one museum where, actually famously, so many objects are on display in the Pitt Rivers. For anyone who can envision the Pitt Rivers, we don't have an image, but yeah, you know, it's crammed with objects on display. So for me, my job as a curator is to understand those objects, understand what they mean in the present, understand not only how we should understand their past and present, but who should be doing that understanding. If for over 100 years those over 10,000 objects have not been studied or understood in Oxford, why should that work not be happening in Cape Town? How can we justify suddenly now the provenance research? And one of the risks here is the scramble for decolonisation, in which some, and we see it at Humboldt Forum in Berlin, the art washing of colonial museums, the bonanza, financial bonanza that some of our museum directors think will happen by suddenly we rebrand what the museum does as, we're finally going to get round to counting these objects we've just been hiding in the storerooms. Maybe some of that work should not be happening in the places that have held on to them for so long. Maybe that important work, because these objects matter, they're important. We know, everyone in this room knows how much art and culture and archaeology and anthropology and history matter. That's why we're here. So I'd like us to recognize that not only leaving objects languishing in the storerooms is a form of silencing, but sometimes the displays themselves can be silencing. Sometimes, you can have, think back to Cecil Rhodes, think of a statue that's a memorial, but a memorial that makes you forget a whole set of things that are not being mentioned. So that sense of, what, of course, the Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe Trouillot, famously in his book Silencing the Past, described as mentions and silences. The idea that mentioning something is a choice, but so also is what's not mentioned. Silences are actions in the same way as mentioning things are. And silencing the past, he famously says, is like silencing a gun. We have to remember that violence and dispossession and forms of cultural racism were at the heart of the collection of very many of these African objects, for Oxford and for institutions like Oxford. So, we need to understand these objects better. We need to talk about who is undertaking that work to understand them. And in the book, I introduce what I call Euro-pessimism. So my Euro-pessimism is such that I'm afraid I've come to the position that I believe that for objects like the Benin bronzes and other such objects taken with violence for the purposes of display that very clearly, in that case, of course, says, we have blown your culture back into the Bronze Age. They were displayed famously in the British Museum, in the Assyrian saloons, alongside objects from the ancient Near East and from ancient Egypt. The idea that the message is your culture is dead. When that has been the purpose, then our job really is to seek to find other ways to bring them back to life. Who does that work? That's part of the question. That's also one for you, I think.
Yeah, there's work to do on all fronts. There's counting. There's provenance work. We need inventories, access to inventories. We need to build partnerships. We need to use this as an opportunity to strengthen the museum sector on the African continent. And that's a very difficult task. My colleague Leslie Witts and I participated in the process of building the Center for Heritage Development in Africa and the International Council of African Museums about a decade and a half ago. Those projects came to a brutal end under circumstances where the resources that funded those projects were redirected to the museum training program of the British Museum. But we've reached a stage where there are possible developments on the horizon. There's the formation a few months ago of the rebranded International Council of African Museums, now called AfriMuhere, African Museums, Heritage and Restitution. There are partnerships beginning to grow. There are important activist, artist projects that have been developing, such as Open Restitution, such as International Inventories Program, that have entered into partnerships with national museums. There's a certain moment, because not only did AFRICOM and Cheddar reach the end of their lives because of a reorientation of funding, and you are creatures of funding by donor funding, by foundations, and you're caught up in that nexus all the time. But those projects ran up against the argument made in the large leading museums that they were universal museums, because they were actually projects that envisaged the National Museum, the African National Museum, as the site of return and restitution. Now we realize the National Museum has a place, the national government has a place, but we do not have a singular model of restitution. And restitution also requires epistemic work, so that you don't return a collection from an ethnographic collection in a European country to an ethnographic collection in an African country. That is not a restitution. That is a relocation of a colonial problem. Right? So we have inventory work to do, and we have epistemic work to do. And we have to have the conversations to understand what it is we mean by restitution.
And that's at the heart of it, then, is a question of knowledge. And so the Euro-pessimism means that for as long as these items in my care are there, my role is to research how they got there and to hand then over the issues, the next work for understanding the historical, archaeological significance of that work. That needs to happen, actually after we've removed this this great layer of ash that's sitting on top of these objects. That it requires for the museum curator in Europe and America a fundamental shift of saying, actually, our primary role is to understand, yes, what is a colonial history, but without foregrounding those histories as more important, by finding ways of telling the histories in order to dismantle what they were seeking to create, so that the significance of items of spiritual, cultural value can be used and thought about outside of these carceral spaces of the museum.
Thank you. It's a lot of work that we need to do, and some of it seems quite daunting. But it's also quite exciting to be a curator at the moment. I invite you to come and speak to our panel members with a glass of wine and a plate of eats privately. They're more than welcome to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much to Professor Dan Hicks and Professor Ciraj Rassool. For a most insightful talk. And thank you to Paul Tichmann for his added input. And thank you to all of you for joining us at Iziko for this important discussion. Thanks.
And thanks to you, Wendy.
Thank you.